All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something really crucial, I think, to the entire pharmaceutical industry. And ultimately, that means it affects all of us as patients, too.
Yeah, for sure. It's about how new drugs, new medicines get developed and approved around the world. And it all comes down to regulations. Like, think of it as a massive rule book that determines how a scientific discovery, something that starts in a lab, actually makes it to patients who need it.
Okay, so basically, you're saying it's like the journey a drug takes from the lab to your medicine cabinet.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that the rules of the game, the regulations, aren't the same everywhere. So today we're going to look at some of the key differences in how some of the biggest regulatory bodies around the world operate.
So you mean like the FDA here in the U.S., right?
Absolutely. The FDA is a major player.
Yeah.
But we'll also be looking at the EMA, that's the European Medicines Agency. Then you've got Japan's PMDA and China's NMPA. We're going to really get into how their approaches to drug approvals compare and contrast.
Wow. Okay, so that sounds like a lot to cover. Um, but I guess the big question is like, why does it even matter that there are these differences, right? I mean, a drug is a drug, isn't it?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. You see, while the ultimate goal is the same, making sure new medicines are safe and effective for patients, the specific pathways to get there can vary quite a bit.
I see. It's kind of like, well, imagine trying to ship a product internationally, and every country has slightly different import rules, safety standards, labeling requirements. It's the same product, but the hoops you have to jump through are different everywhere.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And, the regulations we're talking about here, they cover a massive scope. It's not just about, is the drug effective? It's about everything, from how a drug is manufactured to how it's labeled, even down to how it's distributed.
Yeah.
And each agency has its own very detailed rule book on all of that.
So we're talking about really granular level detail here. I mean, just to get a sense of the scale of this, like in the US, the FDA has something like 21 CFR parts 200 through 299, and those are all dedicated to drug regulations. So we're talking a lot of
A
rules.
lot of rules, a lot of nuance. And it's when you get into those specifics that you really start to see where the key differences emerge between these agencies. So let's start by talking about the very beginning of the drug development process. We're talking preclinical data.
Okay, so that's basically all the research that happens before a drug is even tested in humans, right?
Exactly. And a huge part of that is toxicology studies. Before you can even think about giving a new drug to a person, you need to have a very solid understanding of its potential risks.
Right, makes sense. You need to make sure it's not going to cause any serious harm. And I remember reading in the material our listener sent that a common type of preclinical study is like a 28-day repeated dose study. Usually they do this in rodents, sometimes in other animals too.
Yeah, that's a standard approach. But here's the thing. Even though that general concept is the same, the specific details, like the specific animal species they use, how long the study goes on for, exactly what they're measuring in terms of toxicity, that can all differ between the FDA, EMA, PMDA, and NMPA.
Oh, interesting. So it's not like there's one universal preclinical playbook that everyone follows.
Not exactly. And it's the same story when it comes to the CMC information that needs to be included in an IND. CMC stands for chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. And basically, this is all about showing regulators that you really understand your drug, how to make it consistently, and that it's going to be of high quality.
So you're saying like you need to prove you can make the same drug with the same purity and potency every single time.
Precisely. And again, the general principle is the same everywhere, but the level of detail, what exactly constitutes proof in the eyes of the FDA versus the EMA, for example, that might not be exactly the same in the early stages of development.
Right. I guess in those early phases, you're still figuring a lot out. So maybe the bar for what's considered enough information is a bit lower. But as you progress through the clinical trials, testing the drug in larger groups of people, regulators naturally want more and more assurance that the drug is being produced to a consistent high standard.
Exactly. And that makes sense, right? You're going from small, early studies focused mainly on safety to larger trials where you're also looking closely at effectiveness in a wider range of patients. The stakes get higher as you move along.
For sure. And speaking of those later stage trials, our sources also mentioned something about bioavailability and bioequivalence studies. I have to admit, I'm not totally clear on what those are.
Sure. So bioavailability basically refers to how much of a drug actually gets absorbed into your bloodstream when you take it. You take a pill, But not all of it necessarily ends up, actually active in your body. Some of it might get broken down before it can be absorbed.
Oh, interesting. So bioavailability is like how much of the drug actually gets to where it needs to go to do its job.
Exactly. And then you have bioequivalence studies. These are super important when you're comparing different versions of the same drug. Like, let's say you have a brand name drug and then a generic version comes along. A bioequivalence study is designed to show that the generic drug gets absorbed into the bloodstream in pretty much the same way and to the same extent as the brand name drug.
Okay, so basically it's about showing that the generic version is essentially the same as the original in terms of how your body handles it.
Exactly. And the FDA, as you know, has issued specific guidance documents on how to conduct these kinds of studies back in 2002 and 2003. But the specific details of what those studies need to look like, what the acceptance criteria are, that might differ slightly depending on which regulatory agency we're talking about.
I see. It's like, again, same basic concept, but potentially slight variations in the exact requirements. And this brings us, I guess, to the clinical trials themselves. And our sources touched on something called non-inferiority margins, which, to be honest, sounds a bit complicated.
Yeah, it can be a bit tricky. So imagine you're developing a new drug for, let's say, high blood pressure. Now, sometimes your goal with that new drug isn't necessarily to show that it's drastically better than all the existing treatments out there. Maybe it's just as good as the existing options, but it has some other advantages. Maybe it's easier to take, maybe it has fewer side effects.
Right. So it's not necessarily superior in how well it works, but it brings other benefits to the table.
Exactly. And that's where non-inferiority margins come in. So you design a clinical trial to show that your new drug is, at the very least, not significantly worse than the current standard treatment. And that not significantly worse part, that's defined by the non-inferiority margin. And it's like setting a boundary. You say, okay, the new drug can be a tiny bit less effective, maybe within this specific margin, but it can't be any worse than that.
Okay, so it's like a predefined acceptable range of slightly less effectiveness. But how do they even decide what that margin should be? That sounds like a judgment call.
It is a judgment call. And that's where it gets interesting from a regulatory perspective. The acceptable non-inferiority margin can differ depending on the specific disease you're looking at, the existing treatments available, and the overall risk-benefit balance. And different regulatory agencies might have different opinions or expectations on what constitutes an acceptable margin in various situations.
So again, we see some potential for variation depending on which agency is evaluating the data. Another area where I noticed some differences in our sources is in pediatric drug development. I mean, it makes sense that kids might respond to drugs differently than adults, right? So the studies need to be tailored to them.
Absolutely. There's been a real push in recent years to make sure that new drugs are properly studied in children. Because for a long time, a lot of drugs were just approved for adults, and then, doctors had to kind of guess on the right dosage for kids, which is obviously not ideal.
No, not ideal at all.
Yeah.
So I guess the ethical and scientific importance of pediatric studies is pretty well recognized now globally, right?
Yes, definitely. But when you get into the specifics of, when exactly these studies should be done, how they should be designed, what age groups need to be included, that's where you can still see some variation between different countries and regulatory bodies.
Right. Because there are a lot of ethical considerations when you're talking about research in children. And practically speaking, conducting these trials can be really challenging.
For sure. So we've seen that there's a lot of complexity in this regulatory landscape. It can seem pretty fragmented, honestly.
It does. But I'm guessing there are people trying to, bring some order to this chaos, right? Like some efforts to harmonize these regulations globally.
You bet. That's where the ICH comes, in the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. It's a mouthful. But basically, it's a really important initiative that brings together the regulatory authorities from the US, Europe, and Japan. And they work together to try and develop harmonized guidelines for drug development and approval.
Okay, so it's like they're all trying to get on the same page and, agree on common standards. And I think our sources mentioned something about ICH-Q8, which is focused on pharmaceutical development. What's that all about?
Yeah, Q8 is really interesting. The main thing about it is that it moves away from this really rigid, checklist-based approach to drug development and towards something that's more science-based and risk-managed.
So it's less about ticking boxes and more about really understanding the science behind the drug and its manufacturing process?
Precisely. And the idea is that if you have a deep understanding of your drug and how it's made, you can better control the quality and make sure it's safe and effective for patients.
Makes sense to me. And it sounds like this isn't just theoretical, right? I remember reading that ICH Q8 has actually been revised, Q8R1, I think it was called, to give more specific guidance on how to put these concepts into practice.
Exactly. Q8R1 is all about making these principles actually work in the real world. But beyond specific guidelines like Q8, the impact of ICH is even broader. It's really seen as the starting point for what we now call regulatory science. This whole field that integrates pharmacy, medicine, chemistry, engineering, all these different disciplines.
So it's really about bringing together a lot of different areas of expertise to make sure that drug development and regulation are based on the best possible science.
Exactly. But as great as ICH is, it's not a magic solution that instantly makes all the differences between regulatory agencies disappear. There are still some real challenges when it comes to achieving true global harmonization.
Like what? What are some of the hurdles they're still facing?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is that, different countries and regions might simply have different scientific and ethical standards for what's considered acceptable.
Mhm.
What might be okay in one place might be viewed as way too risky in another. And that reflects different cultural values, different priorities in their healthcare systems, you name it.
And I imagine those kinds of differences can really lead to bottlenecks in the whole drug development process, right? Like if a company has to conduct a bunch of extra studies just to satisfy different regulatory requirements in different countries, that obviously takes more time and costs a lot more money.
Absolutely. And that can delay getting new treatments to patients who need them. One specific example of this is in stability testing, figuring out how long a drug stays good on the shelf. There are harmonized guidelines for this through ICHQ1, but because environmental conditions are so different around the world, some places are hot and humid, others are cold and dry, the packaging and storage requirements for a drug might need to be adjusted for different regions.
Yeah, that makes sense. If a drug has to be shipped and stored in very different climates, you need to make sure it doesn't degrade and become ineffective.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of CMC, the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls side of things. As a drug moves through the development process, from those initial IND filings to a full new drug application or NDA, the level of scrutiny from regulators increases dramatically.
So basically, they need more and more detailed information about the drug and how it's made as you move closer to actually getting it approved for sale.
Precisely. And by the time you're submitting an NDA, the FDA and EA, for example, they want a really comprehensive understanding of your entire manufacturing process, all the potential impurities, how you control the quality, everything.
Wow. So it's like climbing a mountain with increasingly difficult terrain as you go higher. And I guess the requirements for generic drug approvals as NDAs are even more stringent.
Absolutely. And one of the things regulators are really focusing on these days is the potential for genotoxic impurities. These are substances that could damage DNA, which is obviously a major concern.
Yeah, I remember reading about the valsartan recalls a while back. That was a big case where a contaminant was found in some blood pressure medications.
Exactly. And that really shook things up in the industry. Now, regulators expect companies to be much more proactive about identifying and mitigating these kinds of risks in their manufacturing processes.
So we've talked a lot about the general challenges of global regulatory variations, but I'm curious, do you have any like real-world examples of how these differences have played out in practice?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the sources our listeners shared today didn't include specific case studies. But, in a typical episode where we do have those kinds of examples, we dive into stories of drugs that maybe sailed through approval in one country, but then hit a roadblock in another because of differing requirements. Maybe they need to do an extra trial, or maybe they need to collect data for a longer period of time.
And on the flip side, I imagine there are also examples of where harmonization efforts have actually worked really well, and maybe a drug was able to get approved in multiple countries around the same time.
Right. And those kinds of success stories are really encouraging because they show that it is possible to streamline the process and make sure patients everywhere can benefit from new treatments.
And speaking of patients, it's important to remember that this isn't just a theoretical discussion, right? These regulatory variations, they have a real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. From the industry perspective, these differences can mean higher costs, longer development timelines, and really tough decisions about which markets to prioritize. But for patients, it can mean the difference between getting access to a life-saving treatment sooner or having to wait months or even years longer.
And those delays can be incredibly frustrating, especially if you're dealing with a serious illness.
For sure. So the ultimate goal of all these harmonization efforts is really to benefit patients, to make sure that safe and effective treatments are available to everyone who needs them as quickly as possible.
It's like we want to make the process as efficient as possible without cutting any corners when it comes to safety and effectiveness. And looking ahead, it's going to be interesting to see how all the new innovations in drug development, things like gene therapies and personalized medicine, how those are going to impact global regulatory harmonization.
Yeah, that's a big question. It's possible that these new technologies might initially create more challenges, more divergence, as regulators try to figure out how to best evaluate them. But maybe, just maybe, they could also lead to more globally aligned approaches in the long run.
So it's kind of a wait and see situation, but I think it's safe to say that the global regulatory landscape for pharmaceuticals is incredibly complex. You've got all these different requirements, the ongoing efforts towards harmonization, the persistent challenges. It's a lot to keep track of.
It definitely is. But understanding these issues is crucial because ultimately it affects all of us. It impacts how quickly new drugs are developed, how much they cost, and when patients can actually get access to them.
All right, so to wrap things up, here's something for all of you listening to ponder. Given all this complexity, what do you think is the single most important step the pharmaceutical industry and regulators need to take to achieve true global regulatory harmonization? It's a tough question, but it's one worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me.